Okay. All right. We are officially recording. Oh, we lost Paul. Let's get Paul back. So, welcome to the first meeting of 2024. I'm Erin Frigo. I'm the president of the Panhandle Archaeological Society, and our guest speaker tonight is Matt Oliver, discussing his research titled Obsidian Conveyance in Oklahoma. Um, Before we proceed, if everyone could turn off their speakers, that would be great. Also, if you think you're going to be moving around a lot, please also turn off your cameras. And with that, I will give the floor to you, Matt.
All right, let's go ahead and start. Everybody can see that okay?
Looks good.
All right. So my name's Matt Oliver. I just graduated the University of Oklahoma with my master's thesis. So I will be presenting the research that I did for that. And that's Obsidian Conveyance Zones in Oklahoma. Okay, first to introduce the project just a little bit. So I didn't start from the ground up. One day when I was working at the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, I overheard Dr. Brooks talking to Dr. Lentz, Christopher Lentz, about Obsidian in Oklahoma. So I went in there and talked to them about it. And Dr. Lentz passed off his database to me that they had been working on, and he's got data from many states, including Oklahoma, and a lot from Texas too. So I used that database as a jumping off point for this research. And after poring over Dr. Lentz's database, I began to meet with many Oklahoma archaeologists and interviewed them about their observations and opinions on obsidian in Oklahoma to bolster the database as much as I possibly could. And after I had gathered enough information and leads from everyone that I talked to, I began to review the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey site forms. And there are about 38,000 sites in Oklahoma. And I looked through almost all of them except for Osage County, which itself has about 10,000 sites. After doing that, I pulled the references attached to those site forms and compiled more information about obsidian in Oklahoma from published and engraved literature. And that brings me to the research question I was using, and that is, what spatial patterning is expressed by obsidian in Oklahoma? And what do these patterns reveal about cultural interaction through time? Okay, so before I get started on talking about my research project, I want to touch on 4 previous research projects that offered a little bit of a synthesis on obsidian in the Southern Plains in Oklahoma specifically. So the first one is Baugh and Nelson, 1987. They were working with less than 10 sites and concluded that exchange relationships existed between the Southern Plains and Central Plains through the late pre-contact period, and then switched towards the Southwest after contact. The next research project is Cogene and Burkhalter, 2004. All this information is coming from one site. It's called the Hodge site. It's a Custer phase site that's in the late pre-contact period. They had a projectile point base that's sourced to Malad, Idaho, to the distant northwest from Oklahoma, and another flake that's sourced to the Valles Rhyolite Formation in the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico. And from this data, they disputed the dichotomous split between obsidian from the distant northwest earlier in time and from the southwest later in time. And the third research project is a paper presentation that Dr. Robert Brooks gave at the 2014 Plains Anthropological Society. He had some final points on obsidian in Oklahoma. Most of the obsidian from pre-contact sites outside the Panhandle comes from distant northwest sources. That was his first point. The next one was, there's a strong connection between the Southwest and the Oklahoma Panhandle in the late pre-contact period. The next point is that the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico provide all of the obsidian after contact. And then the next research project I want to talk about is Ford, Bevitt, and McLean in 2008. And this occurred in Kansas. And this study is what I used as the framework to develop my study. So they looked at obsidian through time and space in Kansas. And I just sort of dropped that down here to Oklahoma. But in their study, they didn't have any paleo-indigenous obsidian artifacts to actually work with. And they only had two archaic period artifacts, and both of those sourced to those more distant northwest sources of obsidian in Idaho and Wyoming. During Kansas's early ceramic period, which roughly equates to our woodland period in Oklahoma, obsidian is sourcing to those distant northwestern sources in Idaho and Wyoming, and the researchers noted that Kansas was a possible southern fringe of the Hopewellian world during that time. During Kansas's middle ceramic period, which roughly equates to the late pre-contact period in Oklahoma, obsidian becomes more frequent, and samples from southern Kansas tend to source to the Cerro Toledo rhyolite obsidian source in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, and obsidian from the north half of Kansas primarily sources to those more distant northwest sources in Idaho and Wyoming. During the late ceramic period for Kansas, which roughly equates to Oklahoma's post-contact period, obsidian becomes even more common, and nearly all of it sourced to the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico, with Valles rhyolite obsidian being the preferred obsidian type during that time. And they took their study a little bit farther in time than I did. I stopped at the post-contact period, and they took it to the historic American Indian period. And all of the obsidian they researched in Kansas from that time period sourced to the Valles rhyolite formation in northern New Mexico. And I'll return to those previous research projects at the end when I go through my results. So some of the additions to the project that I made were that through reviewing those Oklahoma Archaeological Survey site forms, I was able to discover 61 additional obsidian sites in Oklahoma with obsidian. That brings our total to 178 obsidian sites in Oklahoma. I sourced 110 artifacts, obsidian artifacts, bringing the total number of artifacts sourced in Oklahoma, including all of those before this research project, to 322. That's not a ton, but that's a pretty good amount to parse out some patterns with. I also utilized Esri's ArcGIS to perform spatial analysis for this project. This is something that I probably took for granted throughout most of the process. It's a very powerful tool, and it assisted in graphically displaying the data and teasing out patterns. In ArcGIS, I calculated all of the known sites using centroid UTM coordinates and depicted them based on where the obsidian sourced to. And I did the same for the obsidian sources, so the symbology should match site to source. And as a later dimension to my research project, my research assistant, Elijah Wayland, and I reached out to multiple indigenous communities in Oklahoma to ask for their perspectives on obsidian. There are 37 indigenous communities in Oklahoma, and the Southern Ute have claimed Oklahoma as ancestral hunting territory. So now there's 38 indigenous communities to contact for that. Okay, so here's a map of all of the obsidian sites in Oklahoma that we know of so far. All of the red dots are sites with obsidian that has not been studied yet. All of the blue dots are sites with obsidian that was studied by researchers previous to this project. And all of the green dots are sites with obsidian that I included in my research project here. So you can already sort of see some clustering. There's quite a bit up here in the Arkansas River Valley, quite a bit of obsidian sites in the Panhandle, and quite a few following the Canadian and Washita River valleys down here. All right, so now I'm going to talk about how I formed the obsidian assemblage that I was working with. So Dr. Bonnie Pipleto introduced me to Dr. Scott Brasowski, who's here today, after I read his 2005 dissertation on the Odessa Yates site. It's an incredible site with an enormous amount of obsidian, probably over 2,000 artifacts. And that's well over 99% of the obsidian in the entire state of Oklahoma. So after discussions back and forth and becoming better acquainted with Dr. Brusowski, he agreed to introduce me to some collectors that he knew around the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles who had Obsidian in their private collections and were willing to work with me on this project. Those were Kimmy Carver, Rick Williams, Bill Ramsey, Bob Kearns, Russell Tibbetts, and Harold Ketchell. Dr. Bonnie Pitblado also introduced me to Jim Cox, a private collector in Oklahoma whose collection turned out to be rather important for this particular research project. And Dr. Don Wyckoff introduced me to Tawana Spivey, a private collector with quite a bit of knowledge about Oklahoma archaeology. And so I formed the Obsidian assemblage from all of these private collections, as well as collections held in these 6 museums here: the Sam Noble Museum in Norman, the Museum of the Great Plains in Lawton, the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in the Texas Panhandle, Cimarron County Heritage Center in Boise City, No Man's Land Museum in Guyman, and the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, again in Norman. So after filling out the data set with all of the Obsidian I could locate based on my preliminary review and my experiences with the private collectors, I formed an assemblage of 2,140 Obsidian artifacts from Oklahoma. And to keep some measure of temporal control, I primarily focused on diagnostic artifacts within the assemblage point, particularly projectile points. I had enough funding to submit 110 Obsidian samples for energy dispersive X-ray fluorescence, or EDXRF, sourcing. And I sent those to Dr. Stephen Shackley's lab in Albuquerque for source characterization. I chose to use Shackley's lab for consistency, as most of the Obsidian studied in Oklahoma before this project used Shackley's lab. And I chose to use EDXRF for its cost, its efficacy with Obsidian, and its non-destructive nature, because I had to return all of these artifacts to their owners. Okay, so here is a flow chart that outlines my decision-making process on which of the 2,140 artifacts to submit for Obsidian sourcing. The first one is simple: do not include any artifact already analyzed for source characterization. And to include everyone I worked with, especially the private collectors, I instituted the second rule to ensure that at least one artifact from every collection was in the 110 EDXRF samples. After satisfying rules 1 and 2, I focused on diagnostic projectile points for some measure of temporal control. After rule 3 was exhausted, I focused on non-diagnostic projectile point or non-diagnostic artifacts from excavated context. Those were mostly flakes and biface fragments. There were not very many of these, less than 10. After rule 4 was exhausted, I shifted to including non-diagnostic artifacts from previously recorded sites that have had no Obsidian studied in association with the site before, to retain some measure of spatial control. After rule 5 was exhausted, based on the Obsidian artifacts I could actually locate, I switched to including non-diagnostic artifacts from sites in the main body of Oklahoma rather than the Panhandle, as there's more Obsidian data from the Panhandle than the main body of Oklahoma. And after rule 6 was exhausted, I passed the assemblage through the flowchart one more time to fill out those 110 XRF samples. So here is a map of how many samples per site I included in those 110 samples, and which sites those come from. So the red dots are 1 artifact only, the blue dots are 2, and they just go up in number depending on the site. And everybody will notice that there's some larger numbers on this map. So there were 7 artifacts in my assemblage, which I did not have any tighter spatial data than that they came from Oklahoma. And then the 3 counties in the Oklahoma Panhandle, there were 3 artifacts from Beaver County, 2 from Texas, and 4 from Cimarron County, where I could narrow it down to the county level on the spatial information, but couldn't take it any farther than that. But because most of these were diagnostic projectile points, I went ahead and included them anyways. Here's a map of all the obsidian sources that we've found in Oklahoma so far. So down here in northern New Mexico, there are three sources in the Jemez Mountains. Vias rhyolite is the red diamond that's entirely constricted to the Caldera Rim. Cerro Toledo rhyolite is the yellow sphere. And El Richuelos rhyolite is the orange star. Up in Colorado, in southwest Colorado, we have Cochetopa Dome here, the six-pointed pink star. And in southeast Arizona, there's Cow Canyon. That's the brown upside down triangle. In southwest Utah, we have Black Rock Desert. That's the dark red sun. And surprisingly, in California, we have two very long distant obsidian sources that have appeared in Oklahoma. Glass Mountain is the pink asterisk, and Buck Mountain is the purple four-pointed star. In Wyoming, we had two obsidian sources that showed up in Oklahoma. Obsidian Cliff is that blue square in the northwest corner, and Teton Pass is the light blue star just south of it. Idaho actually had four obsidian sources that popped up in Oklahoma. The major one is the Green Triangle. That's Malad, Idaho. Just north of that, we have Bear Gulch, Idaho. And on the west side of Idaho, we have the Oihe and Timber Butte obsidian sources. And also a more interesting one, well, not more interesting, but interesting one. There was a obsidian scraper from Craig Mound in Spiro that actually sourced to the Pachuca volcanic field in Mexico. So that's an interesting outlier there. Okay, because my research project features the entire archaeological record for the most part in Oklahoma, I had to come up with a typology. And I created this typology based on the obsidian assemblage rather than creating it beforehand to help me designate what type of projectile points there were. So it's a little backwards, but this is just something that I had to do to get the project to work out correctly. So all of these in the typology, there's at least one obsidian projectile point that is one of these types. For the Paleo-Indigenous period, we have Clovis, Dalton, Agate Basin, and Scotts Bluff. For the Archaic period, we have a Calf Creek obsidian point. I think two Marcos, one Pandale. Pandales are fun. They have a twisty blade. Two Frios, and quite a few generalized side or corner notched dart points. For the woodland and late pre-contact and post-contact periods, we have smaller arrow points. The Skylorn is the corner notch arrow point that mostly covers the woodland period, maybe spilling a little bit over into the late pre-contact. There is a Dead Man's Point, which is a small basally notched arrow point from obsidian. And the three major projectile points that we find during the late pre-contact and post-contact period in Oklahoma are these three: the side notched Washita, the side and basal notched Harrell, and the unnotched Fresno. Most of the obsidian projectile points in my assemblage were of these three kinds. Okay, so I originally designed this project to try to tease out exchange networks and exchange patterns in Oklahoma using obsidian, but that didn't quite work out for a number of reasons. It's very difficult to say how someone acquired obsidian in an obsidian-centric research project. Multiple lines of evidence would be able to say a lot more, but I'm only looking at one end where it appears in Oklahoma. So there's always going to be the question of, did people trade for the obsidian? It had to be brought into the state somehow because it doesn't naturally occur here. Did they trade for that obsidian, or did they actually go to the source, however far away it was, directly procure it and bring it back? A lot of that would be tied to mobility, but even in highly sedentary societies where people have to sort of stay generally in one spot for growing crops and storing things, the mobility would be low for that community. But it doesn't mean that it's low for every single individual in that community. So you can still have some individuals that would go very long distances and do whatever they have to do. So in my research, I found 6 specialized long distance resource acquisition strategies that make it difficult to ascertain whether obsidian in Oklahoma was directly procured or traded for. So I'll just go through those quickly. The walkabout strategy is generally a personalized journey where one learns the landscape. You can think of it as sort of a quest. Like the name implies, this has primarily been studied in Australia, but it also occurs in other societies. The next one is the long distance ranger. If we're a small party of 1 to 3 people, would target a specific resource rather far away from their community and bring that back. There's also the Lewis and Clark model. This is a party of people or a single individual on an information gathering journey where one builds social ties, locates resources, gathers news, etc., and brings them back to the community. There's also the rendezvous strategy, which is a meeting place for many different groups of people where exchanges of goods, information, etc., would occur. A good example of this is Chaco Canyon. We know that Chaco had this role at certain times. There's also the idea of the random repeated encounter or overlapping territories between groups of people, but not necessarily economic territories occur. And this would be where meetings with other groups of people are likely to occur, but are not necessarily planned. And then there's the case of the Pochteka traders. So these are Aztec traders in Mesoamerica that were potentially independent from state control, and they distributed artifacts well outside the reach of the Aztec Empire, including into enemy and unconquered territories. So all of that sort of throws a wrench into my idea of using Obsidian sourcing to parse out exchange networks, and the solution to that is a conveyance zone. A conveyance zone is typically an elliptical area centered on an obsidian source or some other datum that stretches to every location that type of obsidian ended up. While not explicitly being able to directly link one locality to another or even a distant locality to the artifact source, conveyance zones can show at least some degree of cultural interaction, even if, say, the obsidian object passed through 84 hands over 200 years to reach its resting place in Oklahoma. You can still see a degree of cultural interaction and a directionality of it through space. So now I'm going to get into the results. It's important to remember that with all the maps and figures that follow, that this includes data from all of the previous Obsidian research before this project, as well as this project. So for all intents and purposes, these maps and figures are syntheses of all Obsidian data in Oklahoma that we know of so far. So there are only 5 data points for the Paleo-Indigenous period, or for Obsidian in the Paleo-Indigenous period in Oklahoma. One of those is the Blankenship Clovis, which I didn't map here. It doesn't have very tight spatial data. All we really know is that it came from Southwest Oklahoma. It is a bit odd looking. It doesn't look like a typical Clovis. And one of the issues surrounding the Blankenship Clovis is its source attribution. So the chemical concentrations show that it's sourced to a Cochetopa Dome in Colorado, which is odd because the obsidian nodules coming out of Cochetopa Dome are pretty small. They're about 5 centimeters. So that's a little iffy as to whether that one came from Cochetopa Dome or not. That small of a nodule would be very difficult to make a Clovis point out of. But there is some hearsay among the community up in the Gunnison Basin that there are larger nodules of Cochetopa Dome obsidian, so it's certainly still a possibility. So here is the frequency bar chart and this windrose diagram, the Paleo-Indigenous period in Oklahoma. Windrose diagrams are typically used to depict wind direction and speed over time, but I think they're also pretty useful to show the directionality and intensity of resources coming into a certain place. Okay, so here's a conveyance zone map for Paleo-Indigenous Obsidian in Oklahoma. You see that we have one artifact, the Scotts Bluff Point from the Flaming Site, coming all the way from Malad, Idaho. That's the green dashed line. Two flakes from the Charlie Terrace site, both sourced to different obsidian sources. One of them from Cow Canyon, Arizona, and one of them is Cerro Toledo Rhyolite in New Mexico. And then we had an agate basin obsidian base that actually came from Dallam County, Texas. Right here, just south of the border, like 4 miles south of the border in Oklahoma, and that's sourced to Cerro Toledo Rhyolite, New Mexico as well. Since we don't have very many obsidian artifacts for the Paleo-Indigenous period, it's really hard to come up with any sort of like sweeping conclusion. Other than that, people during the Paleo-Indigenous period utilizing the area of Oklahoma got obsidian from a variety of different obsidian sources. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the Archaic period in Oklahoma. Obsidian data for the Archaic period in Oklahoma is rather interesting, I think. Luckily, excavations occurring at the Jumper Creek site, it's 34 SM 87 right down here, were occurring as I was doing this research, and some major patterns overall. People in Oklahoma during the Archaic period seem to have a preference for obsidian from the more distant northwestern sources in Idaho and Wyoming over obsidian from the southwest in New Mexico, even in the Oklahoma Panhandle. We also have some rather interesting outliers in the Archaic period. Most of the obsidian artifacts sourcing to El Richuelos rhyolite in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico. That's the closest source to Oklahoma as the crow flies up here in the Archaic period. And we also have these two little interesting guys here that sourced all the way over to Northeast California. This site here, 34 ML 168, is the Hayhurst Cache. That's a Calf Creek site. An obsidian flake found there, sourced to Glass Mountain, California. And in Seminole County again, there was an obsidian biface fragment that's sourced to Glass Mountain, or Buck Mountain, sorry, California. So that gives us a little bit of evidence for some extremely long distance conveyance, that's pretty cool. So here are the frequencies and the Windrose diagram for obsidian during the Archaic period in Oklahoma. As you can see from both diagrams, obsidian from those more distant northwest sources was widely preferred over obsidian from the southwest, particularly New Mexico. So this is a complex map here, just bear with me a little bit. So this is a conveyance zone map that shows all of the obsidian appearing in Oklahoma and where it ended up. The dashed lines are just a few artifacts, probably 5 or less, maybe only 1. The thicker lines had more artifacts, so you can see most of it is coming from Malad, Idaho, some from Obsidian Cliff, Wyoming, and also some from Bias Rhyolite and Cerro Toledo Rhyolite in New Mexico. And here's a zoomed in version of those conveyance zones in Oklahoma for the Archaic period. As you can see, a lot of the obsidian is constricted to the Panhandle. There's a little bit in the Arkansas River Valley here, but most of it stays around the center of Oklahoma and the western part of the state, around the Canadian River Valleys and the Washita and North Fork of the Red River Valleys. Okay, moving now to the Woodland period. Like the Paleo-Indigenous period, there aren't a whole lot of obsidian artifacts that we can strictly put into the Woodland period. Half of those, which don't appear on this map yet, half of those are diagnostic isolated finds from the Oklahoma Panhandle, and the other half are previously recorded sites along the Arkansas River Valley and the North Fork of the Arkansas River Valley up here. So here are the windrows diagram and frequencies bar chart of woodland period obsidian in Oklahoma. And as you can see, it's pretty much evenly split between those distant northwestern sources in Idaho and Wyoming and the closer southwest sources in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico. And so most of those diagnostic projectile points from the Panhandle source to New Mexico, and then most of the artifacts from the previously recorded sites up here in the Arkansas River Valley source to Idaho or Wyoming. And then we had one each that flip-flopped. So there was one Vias rhyolite obsidian flake from one of these sites along the Arkansas River Valley, and one diagnostic projectile point from the Panhandle that source to Malad. And here's a zoomed in map of those woodland period obsidian conveyance zones in Oklahoma. As you can see, most of the obsidian from the northwestern sources pops up around the Arkansas River Valley, with the exception of that Vias rhyolite flake there, and that most of the obsidian from the Oklahoma Panhandle source to Cerro Toledo rhyolite in New Mexico specifically. All right. Moving forward to the late pre-contact period, this map is very busy, so just bear with me on that. It hurts my eyes even a little bit. This is where most of the data for my project ended up, is in the late pre-contact period. Obsidian during the late pre-contact period in Oklahoma is complex, and I found that many of the sites had mixed assemblages of obsidian from both the southwest and those more distant northwest sources in Idaho and Wyoming. More obsidian from the northwestern sources are along the northern margin of Oklahoma, including the Panhandle right here, with some outlying clusters along the Ouachita River in south central Oklahoma, all these down in Garvin County here, and in west central Oklahoma, up here farther along the Ouachita River Valley. So going now to the frequency bar chart and the windrows diagram here, we can see that most of the obsidian in the late pre-contact period is coming from two sources in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, and those are Cerro Toledo rhyolite. That's where most of it's coming from, and then a lesser amount coming from Vias rhyolite. But those still overwhelmingly dominate the entire Oklahoma obsidian assemblage for that time period. We do still get some obsidian sourcing to Malad and Obsidian Cliff in Idaho and Wyoming. So here is a conveyance zone map of all of the late pre-contact obsidian types appearing in Oklahoma. The weighted lines show how many of artifacts of each source appeared in Oklahoma. And as I said before, most of it came from Cerro Toledo. That's that huge thick yellow line. A lesser amount from Vias rhyolite, New Mexico. That's the thick red line. And to an extent, a lesser amount, but also a significant amount from Malad, Idaho. That's the thicker line. All of the other obsidian types are just a handful, one or two, maybe even less. And there's a zoomed in version of the conveyance zone map for the late pre-contact period. You can see here again that most of the obsidian is constricted to the northern margin of Oklahoma, including the Panhandle, also the western part of the state. And the obsidians coming from Idaho and Wyoming primarily stay along that northern margin of Oklahoma, and obsidians coming from the southwest and New Mexico pop up for the most part in the Panhandle or in the western part of the state here. Okay, so here's a map of the post-contact period obsidian in Oklahoma. We're only working with 8 sites here. So 34K3, the Deer Creek site along the Arkansas River Valley, and 34JF1 in Jefferson County down here along the Red River Valley are some interesting outliers for this time period, in that they both source to those more distant northwestern sources in Idaho and Wyoming. We also have one flake from 34BK2. That is the Edwards 1 site that sources to Malad in Idaho as well. Other than those three artifacts, all of the obsidian from the post-contact period in Oklahoma sources to one of the three sources in the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico. So here is the frequency bar chart and windrow's diagram for the post-contact period. As you can see, the assemblage for this particular time period is overwhelmingly dominated by Jemez Mountain obsidians, with Vias rhyolite being the preferred obsidian type by people in Oklahoma during that time. Here's a conveyance zone map of post-contact period obsidian in Oklahoma. So as you can see, and from the maps before, most of it is appearing around the Ouachita River Valley, and primarily coming from the southwest from those two sources in New Mexico, Cerro Toledo rhyolite and Bias rhyolite. Cool. Okay. And here's a zoomed in map of the conveyance zones in Oklahoma for the post-contact period. Again, most of the obsidian is clustered around here in southwest Oklahoma. It's just a little bit up in the Arkansas River Valley, the lower Ouachita River Valley, and the Red River Valley here. So there were only a few artifacts that I could not attach any temporal information to, but I included them in my study anyways. One of those was a projectile point fragment in Kingfisher County, Oklahoma, that sourced to Cerro Toledo rhyolite in northern New Mexico. And there are these two superficial lithic scatters in Cimarron County, and a surface flake from each source to Cerro Toledo rhyolite and Malad, Idaho. So that again speaks to both patterns being present throughout much of the archaeological record in Oklahoma. There's an emphasis on obsidian from New Mexico later in time, and an emphasis on obsidian from Idaho and Wyoming earlier in time. So now I'm going to loop back and respond to those previous arguments by those four researchers I mentioned before. So for Baugh and Nelson, 1987, they mentioned that a shift occurred at contact from those northwestern sources in Idaho and Wyoming to the southwest, and new data from my research shows that that shift probably occurred during the late pre-contact period, and perhaps even a few hundred years before contact, and that a link between the southern plains and the more distant northwestern sources still exists in the post-contact period. For Kogene and Burkhalter 2004, my data does support their hypothesis in that links to obsidian sources to the southwest and the more distant northwest existed in both the late pre-contact and post-contact periods. Robert Brooks's 2014 presentation on obsidian in Oklahoma, he had a few major points at the end. One of those was that most obsidian outside of the Panhandle comes from more distant northwestern sources. With new data from this project, we know now that this is only true for the Archaic and Woodland periods. Another point was there's a strong connection between the Oklahoma Panhandle and the Southwest. This is true throughout time, but this tie increases in strength during the late pre-contact period in the Panhandle as well as in Western Oklahoma. Brooks's point that all obsidian from the post-contact period is coming from those obsidian sources in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico is no longer true with new data from my project. And lastly, Ford, Bevitt, and McLean in 2008, I had a strikingly similar patterns I teased out for Oklahoma that they did for Kansas. But Oklahoma has a bit more data for the Archaic and Woodland periods, so I was able to say a little bit more about those time periods than they could up there. In both states, there's a preference for obsidian from distant northwest sources in Idaho and Wyoming until the late pre-contact period. During the late pre-contact period in Kansas, there's a preference for Cerro Toledo rhyolite from New Mexico. This matches the Oklahoma Panhandle But during the same time period in Western Oklahoma, people living there showed a preference for Vias rhyolite obsidian rather than Cerro Toledo. And during the post-contact period, the data from my project matches the Kansas project with the preference seen in both states for Vias rhyolite obsidian. So that late dimension in my thesis was my thesis research was gathering indigenous perspectives on obsidian that were different than archaeological perspectives. And so because this was a late addition to the research project, Elijah Whalen, my research assistant, and I didn't make it quite through the entire list. We did contact all 19 of these tribes here and ask for their perspective on obsidian. We only had one positive response that was from Verl Keeter. He is Cherokee Nation's national treasure for flint knapping. For the most part, he just wanted to talk about flint knapping obsidian, which is great. Low cost, easy to learn on, stuff like that. But he also mentioned that he knew of some obsidian moving down the Verdigris River Valley pre-contact, which is interesting, very interesting for this project. So to wrap things up, I'm returning to my research question: what spatial patterning is expressed by obsidian in Oklahoma, and what do these patterns reveal about cultural interaction through time? Well, as you all saw through all of the various maps, there's quite a bit of spatial patterning expressed by obsidian in Oklahoma, and we can see shifts in cultural interaction through time based on that obsidian research. So some future research directions that I would like to see happen are on the assemblage that I pulled together of the 2,140 artifacts, a lithic analysis should probably be implemented on that assemblage, and that would give us another line of evidence and speak to maybe how people in Oklahoma were getting obsidian through time, because my research wasn't actually able to answer that. You can say where and when, just not how. We also need to fill out those maps with additional data from other states so that we can push those conveyance zones, push the envelopes of those a little bit bigger. For many of the sites in the late pre-contact and post-contact period, we could probably attach a cultural affiliation to those sites, and that would speak to different relationships between different groups of people during those time periods using obsidian. And we also need to inquire for some more indigenous perspectives on obsidian with those 18 other indigenous communities we didn't make contact with yet. And there's also the curious case of El Richuelos rhyolite. So in all of the 322 samples of obsidian sourced in Oklahoma and studied so far, only 6 of those have sourced to El Richuelos rhyolite. And it's technically the closest source to Oklahoma. So there's some interesting things going on there. Many people have mentioned that the obsidian in the Caldera Rim, in the Jemez Mountains, the Vias rhyolite only occurs inside the rim. So it's easily culturally controlled. And El Richuelos rhyolite occurs farther north, outside of the rim. So we could be looking at certain groups of people pushing a certain type of obsidian on people that lived in adjacent regions to the southwest. And for some reason, they were either ignoring or pushing away from El Richuelos rhyolite. But I want to sink my teeth deeper into that issue because it's very curious. All right, and that brings me to the end. Well, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you, Scott, for setting this up. Thank you, Aaron, for facilitating everything. And now if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer those.
All right, thank you so much, Matt. Does anyone have any questions?
Contact information?
Sure. Let's see. Let me put it in the chat. All right. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So Matt, you mentioned at the end there about El Richuelos being the closest source to Oklahoma. Isn't El Richuelos also the highest quality obsidian source in the Jemez Mountains?
No, Vias rhyolite is the highest quality. El Richuelos is right in the middle. It's a little bit better than Cerro Toledo. It doesn't have quite as many ash pockets and spherulites or anything like that in it. But it's not quite as the matrix isn't quite as consistent as the Vias rhyolite obsidian. And Vias rhyolite also occurs in larger nodules than El Richuelos. On the other hand, there has been some research that shows that Folsom people preferred El Richuelos rhyolite for their Folsom points in the Southwest. So it's right in the middle. It's not the worst. It's not the best.
Because I thought that the research that Matt Boulanger has been doing is showing that the Pueblo people in the Jemez Mountains, their obsidian is dominated by El Richuelos.
Interesting.
He attributed it to being the highest quality, and his sample sizes are like in the hundreds for individual
wow.
sites.
I'm gonna have to review some of that. I still need to send him my my sourcing data to build up his database, so I need to do that very soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely something to look into. Thank you, Scott.
Matt, great presentation.
Thank you.
I couldn't tell from your slides, were any of those locations along Wolf Creek?
Wolf Creek. Let's see. What county is Wolf Creek in?
I think it's starts in
Ellis County,
yeah.
Northwest Oklahoma.
Yep. 1 second.
It'd be just
There's
to
only one site in Ellis County that has had obsidian on it. I'm not sure if it's on Wolf Creek or not. Let me try to see. Hold on a second. See if I can share this again. There we go. Yeah, so the only site in Ellis County with obsidian is right here, just north of the South Canadian. I'm not sure if that's where Wolf Creek is, but that's all we have for Ellis County.
thank you. That's what I was asking about.
Absolutely.
All right, any more quick questions?
So Matt, as kind of a follow-up too, it'd be interesting looking at your shift from kind of northwest sources during the Archaic and Woodland period.
Mhm.
It'd be interesting to see if there are projectile point types that are more commonly associated with the Northwest Plains during the Archaic and Woodland periods that occur in Oklahoma during those same time periods.
Yeah, that's
So
an avenue to look into.
points like Allen points and Mallory points and other points that are typically thought of as Northwest Plains.
Mhm.
And Jesse Ballinger, who he may have already left this talk, but because we see points that occur out here in the Oklahoma Panhandle and the Texas Panhandle that are more considered more Northwest Plains than Southern Plains for sure.
Right.
And I know you may be moving on to something else after this, but there's definitely patterns in that sort of thing that we see earlier on during the late Paleo-Indian and during the Archaic period up here in the Panhandles.
That certainly makes sense. We have a Scotts Bluff point from a flaming site that's sourced to Idaho. Yeah, that's something to look into.
Because I know Jesse Ballinger, he did a report on artifacts from the Ralph White collection along Goff Creek. And
Yeah,
he
yeah,
had
yeah.
had a whole bunch of kind of Northwestern Plains points occurring in that collection. And I think maybe a trend there that matches with your Obsidian data.
Oh, okay,
But
interesting.
it's interesting that you maybe don't see that in other parts of Oklahoma, in the main part, that you don't see those points occurring in the central body of Oklahoma.
That's true. Sort of stick to the high plains. Well, that's definitely something to look into. That's a good avenue.
All right, well, if that's all the questions and comments we have, Matt, I thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And I guess we'll call it a night in terms of presentation.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody.